It's go time.
The Edmonton Elks fired general manager and head coach Chris Jones after an 0-5 start that featured 3 straight last-play field goal losses in their last 3 games. No teams remain undefeated in the CFL, but after Week 6 there are still 2 that are winless. When is not a good time to challenge a call on the field? Mike O'Shea may have that answer for you. Welcome everyone to Third Down Gamble with your hosts, Don Charbon and Heath Graham. After another last play field goal loss, we'll get into the game particulars later. Chris Jones, though, this tour did not go as well as what his first one was when he was first with the Elks in 2014 and 2015.
There was a lot of speculation that he wasn't going to survive the Elks bye week. He did. Unfortunately, it turned into another loss for the Elks. So overall, Chris Jones's record in this tenure with the Elks is 8-33. 0-5 to start this year, 0-9 to start last season. His first season back in Edmonton, they were 0-3 to start the season. So slow starts year over year add up, and it really puts you behind trying to make any kind of playoff push. Chris Jones out less than a third of the way through this season.
He only produced 2 wins at home during his tenure. Can he be blamed for everything that went on? No. However, the fact that he set up this perpetual training camp using the regular season to continuously bring in more players, never developed any continuity with anybody out there, maybe other than the offensive line and the defensive line. But otherwise, it was just everybody was moving through that turnstile as fast as they could go. And that did not suffice to get the consistency that any coach would want.
And when you're the head coach and general manager, it does fall on you overall. You can look at philosophy differences in some organizations between a coach and a general manager, but when you are that guy, the buck stops with you. And one of the biggest struggles for Chris Jones and the Edmonton Elks was the inability to settle on a starting quarterback over these past 3 years. We have seen McLeod Bethel-Thompson, we've seen Jarrett Daggy, we've seen Taylor Cornelius, Trey Ford, on and on of quarterbacks that have had the chance to show something, and half of the Edmonton Elks wins in this 8-33 run were with Trey Ford as the starting quarterback. He was 4-5 as the starter. We haven't seen him have any significant role yet this season, and that begs to question, are the new coaches going to be implementing him a bit more into this offense? You can't pin the offer squarely on McLeod Bethel-Thompson. He has put up some huge numbers in a few of these games as the starting quarterback, but overall, it's still an 0-5 and something needs to change.
In the last 5 years, the Edmonton Elks have gone through 2 general managers, 3 team presidents, and 4 head coaches. That adds up. Now, Scott Milanovich and all of that never coached a game, and that was the COVID cancel year. We'll give a pass on that one. But Jamie Elizondo, 3-11, that didn't work out at all. They thought with the notion of bringing Chris Jones back to a place where he had success. He had won a Grey Cup with this franchise. The hope was that he could rekindle some of that magic, but it just never came to be. Is Chris Jones now a marketable coach / general manager from here out, or is it just coach only, given that 2 experiments with him as titled in both roles have not gone extremely well?
It's a question to keep an eye on in the future. Right now, as far as the CFL goes, I don't know if there's any team out there that is in a position to look at him as a coach and GM, except maybe Hamilton, who also hasn't won a game yet this season. I believe everybody else is pretty happy with their coaching situation as far as head coaches go. I don't know what's next for him. We know he did leave the CFL for a little stint in the U.S. He was in some high school programs. He was a consultant with the Cleveland Browns. So he has football pedigree. I just don't know if that future is going to be here in Canada.
The future could be here in Canada. I don't see that this ends his tenure completely. We'll find out in years to come whether that statement is true or not. I think, though, that the one thing that ends is giving him player personnel control. That will probably not be, because if you give him the keys to the entire building, it doesn't seem to go as well as what people hope. You look at his tenure with the Rough Riders, for instance. He starts 5-13 in 2016. He goes 10-8 and 12-6. He loses the East Final in 2017. He loses the West Semifinal in 2018. Everyone's thinking, well, there's a build here. Here we go. 2019 comes along and he's gone. And the Rough Riders have to move very quickly to another head coach. He comes back to Edmonton. He goes 4-14, 4-14, and then 0-5. He has a 22-game home losing streak in the midst of it. Not all of it his. Jamie Elizondo and even Jason Moss have a little bit to play in that. When you look at all of the detritus that comes through this post-COVID era of the Edmonton Elks, so much of it has to fall on his shoulders because he's the guy that's got the keys.
If I'm a team president or an owner, I'd be hesitant to give anybody full reign as a head coach and general manager. I look at both of those positions as being a full-time job. And for one person to try to take on both of those, it is very challenging. We've seen success, absolutely. Somebody like Wally Buono comes to mind. But you also see people getting in over their heads and failing to really have success in the dual role. And I think you need to have good communication between the two, but it also needs to be separate. And the coach can only coach the players that a general manager brings in. So if you have a good relationship and you're comfortable with the decisions that are being made, the product on the field ends up being better.
I can't agree more. I would think, though, that there will be some circumstances where we will see a dual role in the future, but you have to have a really, really strong person. And that Chris Jones, it didn't work out for him, doesn't reflect poorly on his character. It just may be, especially given the fact that he just never seemed to settle on a lineup, that really became his undoing. And in a way, it sabotaged his whole tenure in Edmonton. You look at the myriad of players that rolled through there. I lost count, I think, at about 3,000. So I'm not sure. Well, I'm just kidding, of course. It felt like it. I made the comment last week that it seems like Chris Jones is absolutely adamant that nobody knows every player's name on the roster. He keeps flipping them around. Joking aside, but that really does impact. How do you develop continuity?
Absolutely, and not just the quarterbacks that I mentioned that he was struggling to find or settle on a starting quarterback, but you look at even partway through this season, they bring in Sean Oakman on that defensive line. Still an impactful player, but a little bit long in the tooth. So he's somebody that comes in, you're looking at maybe 20 to 25 defensive snaps that he's going to be in the game. There is no continuity there, and you want to build a core group of players that you build out from. And that's what we've seen be successful on teams. We know the Argos have lost some players to free agency this year, but they built a really strong core of players. Winnipeg has had success over the last few years of building a really strong core. And maybe it's a lack of finding the right guys, but it seems more like almost a panic mode of not having the patience to build that and just keep looking at the next shiny thing.
Rick Lawlisher comes into the Elks last year, and at the time, the Elks are 1-9. Nothing is done about the coaching situation at that moment, and even after a second straight 4-14 season, Jones is still left in charge. Now, he does shed his defensive coordinatorship, and Jason Shivers is brought in from the Saskatchewan Roughriders. And after an 0-5 start, especially coming after the bye, it seems to be a bit of odd timing. Part of this may play into, and it was stated, that there is an ownership bidding going on right now through Park Lane and all the work that they do for the CFL in terms of financial advisement. The new ownership group may not have wanted that baggage, and whatever that ownership group may be, they all seem to come to consensus that that's not who we want to be our person. Now let's look at the situation they've got. They've got an interim GM and an interim head coach. If you're coming in as a new owner, maybe that's optimal for you. You get to pick and choose.
I agree with that. When Chris Jones survived the bye week, I thought maybe he was going to remain at the helm until an ownership announcement was made. We know it's forthcoming. It sounds like it might be as early as August 1st that a new ownership group will be announced. Jarious Jackson will be the interim head coach, Geroy Simon the interim general manager. Both of them were in assistant roles already. They have to look at this as an opportunity, although a short one, to make an impression on whoever is going to be the new owner or owners of the Edmonton Elks. They have the opportunity to stick with them even through the remainder of the 2024 season and give them that audition, or whoever takes over may have some other ideas already in mind, and it'll be a situation worth keeping an eye on for sure, especially at that head coach position. If Jarious Jackson comes in and even gets them to a 6-12 record, it would probably be a fairly successful audition.
The other thing that you have to consider through all of this is that when you invest so much of your franchise into one person, if you have to make a decision, look at how much of a vacuum you create in behind that firing. You've got to get a general manager, a head coach, and had it happened last year, it would have been a defensive coordinator all wrapped up in one. That's just too much invested in one person. If you were watching the game between the Saskatchewan Roughriders and the British Columbia Lions on Saturday night, you saw that Nathan Rourke came into the TSN booth to talk to the hosts of the broadcast. Interestingly, when pushed on the question of where are you going to be if this happens or that happens, two things came out. One is that Nathan Rourke now seems to be more open to the idea of returning to the Canadian Football League. And secondly, he certainly hinted that BC would be his top choice.
I'm not surprised to hear him say that BC would be his top choice. He did fit in quite well. With what Vernon Adams Jr. is doing on the field this year, I don't anticipate him coming in and unseating Vernon Adams as the starting quarterback of the British Columbia Lions. It looks like Rourke is going to give one more good run at the NFL. Even if he ends up on a practice roster, he's going to be making pretty decent money in US dollars, so I don't see the rush to return. We'll have to wait and see it, and if he does not successfully navigate a training camp and end up on a practice roster somewhere, I don't know what happens to the rest of the year. I just would be shocked if BC anoints him as the number one guy, given you've got a starting quarterback on pace for over 6,000 yards passing currently.
Vernon Adams Jr. is having a career start to his season, and even talk of 6,000 passing yards is just unheard of. He is playing that well, and he is absolutely torching every defense that he sees. It would be very difficult to put in Rourke if he comes back, and we're playing the speculation game. But he has to go through training camp at New York. He's got to see what happens. The problem for Nathan Rourke, if you remember back, he went through about 12 camps before he landed with Jacksonville. He had all those opportunities, and it was only Jacksonville that seemed to come forward. With all of that, now he's up in New England. Is it that the last stop before the door opens and doesn't ever reopen for you? That's, I think, what he's coming to a realization of. And seriously, if you're his age, how much of the time do you want to stand on the sideline and do nothing? This was a question posed to Bo Levi Mitchell when he did his NFL tryouts back a few years ago. And it was the Minnesota Vikings that actually said to him, look, you can either be a great backup here, you can hold the clipboard as long as you want, or you're playing very well in the league that you're in. Why not be a big star up there? You'll make decent money. What's the problem?
I guess the thing with the NFL is there are 32 teams, so you've got 32 starting quarterback positions, 32 backups, 32 third stringers. Is Nathan Rourke one of the top 100 quarterback prospects for the NFL? I would say he likely is. But we have discussed on this podcast previously, it's not necessarily 100% talent-based. It's also connections of who you know, who you've played for in the past, what kind of system that you came from. And that is probably more hurting Nathan Rourke at this point than his football ability. And it's finding a situation where he is going to fit in. Nathan Rourke does have an opportunity with the New York Giants this season. There are some questions about their number one quarterback. I don't think he's outright competing for that number one starting job, but maybe a second or third string. Beyond that, if he doesn't stick with the Giants, there may be a couple of opportunities because other teams are pretty young in the quarterback room. If he doesn't land somewhere this season, evolve into a number two guy, I don't think there's going to be many more chances beyond this season.
Last week, I had railed against a call against Reddick Ramsey when he hit Drew Brown with a forearm shiver as Drew Brown was sliding forward. Of course, it raised a bunch of questions, and especially if you're a quarterback, why put yourself at the mercy of a defense if they're just going to clock you anyway? The CFL did do some follow-up discipline and announced some additional fines, and one of them was to Reddick Ramsey for the hit that he laid on Drew Brown. He got the maximum, which is, I think, a half a game check. But I thought that the CFL would go more, especially in light of what happened a few years ago when Garrett Marino nearly ended and may have ended the career of Jeremiah Mazzoli in Regina. You would have thought that everybody would be hypersensitive to this notion that, hey, we got to protect these quarterbacks because they are the feature of the game.
Both of the hits on sliding quarterbacks in that game resulted in maximum fines as well. So we did get the follow-up, kind of what I had expected to see in these situations. But you're right, bringing up Garrett Marino certainly opens the door for further discussion on how to protect quarterbacks. And for those that don't remember, he was suspended 2 games for the hit and 2 games for his subsequent behavior, which resulted in a total of a 4-game suspension. You look at the late hit by Cramdy and the spear on Chris Strevler, and is further discipline warranted? You can certainly look at it, and maybe I didn't verbalize it completely when we were having the discussion last week. I know where you stand on this, and had Cramdy been ejected from the game for that hit, I probably wouldn't have questioned that either. I did think that it should have been flagged absolutely. It was a late hit, 100%. I wasn't surprised that he wasn't ejected, but again, if he had been, you have to look at the situation and think they're protecting the quarterback. It's a decision to make to disqualify a player from a game. When these situations come up, the officials make a decision at the time. Their decision was not to disqualify. Maybe in the future this will be further looked at and we will see more disqualifications moving forward.
Tobias Harris, when he got his 15-yard foul against Chris Strevler for spearing, that was the booth that stepped up and said, wait a minute, that was more than just what you saw on the field. The problem I had with the booth was, why didn't they do the same thing with Cramdy's hit on Brown? Now, Reddick Ramsey, I don't think we're ever going to hear from him again in terms of fines and suspensions and stuff like that. He's a quality person. He's a quality player. He made a mistake. This is the point I'm trying to make. It's what happened. Don't assess intent necessarily, although encompass it, but what happened to the guy that got hit?
Well, unfortunately, in this situation, Drew Brown was able to start this week. It did knock him out of that game for concussion protocol. Thankfully, it was nothing beyond that. And when we break down that game, we can talk a little bit about how Drew Brown bounced back from that injury.
I'm Jared Taylor, the voice of the Bombers on 680 CJOB, and I listen to the Third Down Gamble podcast.
4 games in the Canadian Football League, and wow, were we treated to some excellent football. It started with the Alouettes and the Toronto Argonauts in Montreal. The Alouettes putting their colossal winning streak on the line. They hadn't lost for 13 games. Unfortunately for them, Cody Fajardo pulls a hamstring late in the second quarter.
Unfortunate to see Cody Fajardo go down. He was 5 for 6 in this game, so continuing his success of high completion percentage. We don't know the extent of his injury as of yet. Fortunately for the Alouettes, this is their bye week, so he will have a week of recovery on top of the normal rest period, so we'll see what happens with Cody moving forward. The Alouettes are known also for their standout defense, and in this one, the Argos found ways to score beyond challenging that defense. Jarious Grant had his second return touchdown this season. Winton McManus had an interception return for a touchdown as well. So 14 points on those big plays for the Argonauts helped seal this victory.
When you go in and you thump a team that's the defending Grey Cup champion in their home park, 37-18, it really sends a statement. The other thing that came out of this that I cannot believe will be understated and has to be recognized as sort of a bounce back is the way that Cameron Dukes managed the game and played in the game. He was on point throughout most of it.
He was, and again, with an untested or a young quarterback, you're going to see some ups and downs. We know last week was a bit of an off week for Cameron Dukes. This week he bounced back 16 for 20, 131 yards. So again, Ryan Dinwiddie is not asking him to do too much. The importance of protecting the football showed in this one. 16 completions, no turnovers, and 1 touchdown pass. A solid night for Cameron Dukes. And spreading the ball around, he targeted 9 different receivers. 8 of them caught. He targeted Jarious Grant once for an incompletion, but everybody else that he threw the ball towards had at least 1 catch in this one.
The other part of this game that was unbelievable was in the second quarter. There were 5 series in a row that went for touchdown. It was just so much fun, and you thought if they kept up this momentum, this game could be in the 70s.
It was, and it's great to see Jarious Grant back to his top form as well. This is his 10th return touchdown in under 45 CFL start. An incredible pace. It's a record-setting pace. If he were to keep this up, he would be right up at there in the upper echelon of kick returners in the CFL. A bit surprising that he slipped away from the Winnipeg Blue Bombers in the offseason, but the Argonauts picked him up and are certainly reaping the rewards of doing so.
For Montreal, as you mentioned, they go into the bye. This will be a chance to see what happens with Cody Fajardo. Caleb Evans struggled just to get his feet under him, but then seemed to settle down. It wasn't him that cost the Alouettes the game. It just looked like the Argonauts had a mission and they were going to accomplish it. They were embarrassed with what happened to them in Toronto when the Alouettes came in there and beat them 30-20. They were going to come back and do the same in their home park. That makes a mess of the top of the East. We'll get into what Ottawa did later, but the East right now, outside of Hamilton, is a 3-horse race.
It is, and we saw the Argos run away with it last year. They had pretty much wrapped up first in the East by Labor Day weekend. This win over Montreal splits the season series thus far. They do have a 3rd game coming up as well. So it didn't allow the Alouettes to, in week 6, win the season series, which is important. And having them now with 1 in the loss column brings them back a little bit into the mix, and it's going to be a really interesting race coming down the stretch in the East.
We step forward to Friday night, and a game that really proved to be a stellar contest to watch, as they all were in their own way. Each game had its moments. Some came right down to the end. This one, no exception. The Calgary Stampeders and the Winnipeg Blue Bombers going toe-to-toe in Winnipeg, where the Blue Bombers have to post 41 to defeat the Stampeders, 41-37. I had quipped at the beginning of the season that if Winnipeg was going to win 10 games this year, they'd have to score probably 35-40 to do it each night. Here we go.
I'm going to start off by saying this is the first home game in Winnipeg that I've attended in 11 years, and what a game to pick. This one, I was back in Manitoba for some family reasons and had the opportunity to go to this game. And wow, it was a roller coaster of emotions for everybody in attendance. There was ups and downs. And at the end, a couple of big calls by Mike O'Shea going for a 2-point conversion to put them up by 4. A couple of reasons they did this is it took a field goal to tie off the board. It also gave them the point differential win in splitting the 2 games with the Calgary Stampeders this season. A gutsy call in that situation, though. If they were not successful, Calgary coming the other way with Rene Paredes with a chance to win probably was going to pull it off. This put that out of reach for the Stampeders, and a really, really exciting game.
What was the crowd atmosphere like when the obligatory Zach Collaros interception in the end zone went down?
Well, to defend Zach a little bit, he was back from missing a week for injury. He came out throwing in this one, and unfortunately, we've seen this script before where he goes on a deep corner route to the end zone, seems to underthrow and hang the ball up a little bit for an interception. So it wasn't really shocking to the fans, but the frustration was palpable. He came back, threw another important touchdown to Nick Dembski late in the game. I think all was forgiven there, but it's something that Buck Pierce needs to be aware of. Is it seems more often than not on those deep corner routes the ball's underthrown, so maybe they need to look a little bit differently on how the receivers react and give a chance and not just have it as a toss-up for the defensive back to pick off.
Trey Robertson had 2 interceptions in this football game, a huge night for him. The other aspect of this game that I want to get into is the challenge of the incomplete pass to Nick Dembski. Dembski, on replay, clearly catches the football, but because the play is blown dead, at best he's going to be at -2 on the reception, so it'll be 2nd and 12. And yet Mike O'Shea makes the challenge anyway. I'm not sure how you felt about it. I know I was borderline apoplectic when I saw him throw that red challenge flag.
There was a lot of confusion in the stands when the Bombers won the challenge, and then you see it's a 2nd and 12. I don't think everybody fully realized the implication of where the spot of the ball was. Had it not been whistled dead and ruled a completion, Nick Dembski would have had a first down on the play. But because they whistled it incomplete, even though it was overturned, it was at the spot of the completion. Mike O'Shea, by his own admission, was a bit stubborn in this one. He wanted to throw the challenge to prove a point. And I guess the point was that the closest official to the ball called it complete and was overruled by somebody 30 or 40 yards off the ball that came running in. And maybe that's what he was trying to get to. But fortunately for the Bombers, they continued that drive and ended up scoring. All was forgiven, but certainly a play that you don't see often. And one that I don't know that Mike O'Shea would necessarily throw that challenge flag for again.
Jake Maier played a stellar game, 20 of 31 for 316 yards. Zach Collaros, a great game himself, 27 of 36 for 344. Brady Oliveira went for 100 yards on 15 carries, 109 yards. The Stampeders, Dedrick Mills goes 15 carries for 131 yards the other way, 8.7 yards per carry. What a stellar stat against the Winnipeg defense. It's usually very good against the run. The turning point of this football game came late in the game. The Stampeders are driving for that go-ahead touchdown. Not been sacked all night. Jake Maier, for whatever reason, checks off 2 or 3 receivers and stands in the pocket and waits, I think, a little too long. And finally, the Winnipeg pressure gets to him and creates a very difficult 2nd and long.
One thing that really stood out seeing this game in person is the inability of the Blue Bombers defensive line to pressure quarterbacks. Jake Maier is not a running quarterback. He's somebody that's going to be in the pocket. And it took Jake Thomas, of all people, to fight his way through coverage and get the sack. It's a situation that the Bombers are going to need to address. And I wouldn't be surprised come NFL cut-down days that there's a few more defensive linemen working their way into that Blue Bombers camp. One standout that we haven't mentioned yet was breakout performance for Ontario Wilson, a rookie receiver for the Blue Bombers. He was targeted 16 times, 13 catches for 201 yards. This is the best scenario that the Bombers could hope for with the injury losses of Dalton Schoen and Kenny Lawler. Wilson has stepped into Lawler's role, and he also was very close to hauling in another touchdown pass off the fingertips on a deep ball. So a breakout game for a rookie receiver is something that was much needed for the Bombers.
With Kenny Lawler out, as you mentioned, there was a big question mark as to who would threaten defenses, and Ontario Wilson really proved it. He had a great night, great revelation. This is part of what the CFL is all about. We find diamonds in the roughs all over the place. Here's another one that's made his name quickly with the Blue Bombers. Now, he's on the radar of every other defense that's coming toward Winnipeg. This is going to be the real test. If you're Kenny Lawler, you can still figure out a way to beat that defense. Now for Wilson, that's his question. Can I do the same? Saturday night, it was the battle for first place in the Canadian Football League, with the Saskatchewan Roughriders taking their undefeated record against the British Columbia Lions. The BC Lions started fast, started furious, and never really were threatened by the Roughriders as they rolled to a 35-20 win.
It seems weird to say, but it was kind of a pedestrian 451 yards for Vernon Adams throwing the football. He at times was brilliant, at times not so much, throwing a couple of interceptions, but he was 26 for 42 for 451 yards. He continues at a record pace and is doing some spectacular things for the BC Lions. And if not for a couple of drops by Alexander Hollins, this score would have been even more lopsided. He had a couple of opportunities to put up some big plays, one of them in the end zone. It was a big night again for Justin McInnes for the Lions. That receiving core is ready to roll and is only going to get better with the return of Keon Hatcher coming up soon.
You mentioned the drops of Hollins. Also, the Saskatchewan Roughriders with Jarrett Stearns had a ball that he lost in the lights or something, and it hit him on the back as he crossed the goal line. That would have been a huge play for the Roughriders at that moment. They finally get their number one signing offensively, A.J. Ouellette, going, 12 carries for 72 yards. But as you mentioned, it's Vernon Adams all over this game, and did Justin McInnes have a night for the ages? 14 targets, 14 receptions, 243 yards, 1 touchdown.
Yeah, huge night. And you look at the comparison, Alexander Hollins also targeted 14 times, just 5 receptions for 83 yards and a couple of key drops. Piece of concerning news for the Saskatchewan Roughriders as well. We saw Jamarcus Hardwick go down with an apparent left leg injury and was carted off in this one. So that could be a big loss to the Riders' offensive line moving forward.
The Rough Rider defense against the run is again as strong as ever. As you look at the stats from William Stanback, they were almost non-existent. 12 carries for 14 yards.
And Anthony Lanier II continues to be a force on that defensive line for the Riders as well. A couple of big stops in this one. So it's not the defense that's hurting them right now. Shea Patterson, again filling in for Trevor Harris, had an okay day, but needs to really move that offense if they're going to have a chance to continue to fight with BC for first in the West.
I wouldn't put this one on Shea Patterson. 17 of 25 for 278 is not a bad day at the office. The problem is the guy across from you is throwing for 450. This is this mosh pit that I get sick of. They tried a 3rd and 1 at the goal. It didn't work out. Unless you've got a giant like Tommy Stevens in Calgary, what is the point of having the quarterback sneak at the goal line? Everybody in the world knows what you're doing. Why not spread the offense and make the defense guess? We saw that with Edmonton, where they had to go to 3rd down to try to score a touchdown at the 1-yard line. This is just stupid.
It is. It's too predictable, and defenses are getting better and better at these short yardage situations. Even at midfield on a 3rd and short, oftentimes they bring out the sticks and they don't get the first down by very much. So some more creativity. We've seen some teams take direct snaps to fullbacks in these situations as well to give it a little bit of a different look. It was a tough situation for the Riders to find themselves in.
We finish up with what would be Chris Jones' final game as head coach with the Edmonton Elks. The Ottawa Redblacks come into town, struggle off the start, trail most of the game, and then find their way in the fourth quarter, take advantage of the situation. And Drew Brown was throwing darts once he got going. And the Ottawa Redblacks, on a final play field goal, have we heard that song before? Defeat the Edmonton Elks 37-34 in a wild one in Edmonton that with 8 seconds to go, the Elks had tied the game.
We alluded to Drew Brown a little bit earlier, talking about him coming back from the injury against Winnipeg. 480 yards in this one, 26 for 38, 2 touchdowns and an interception. Again, we can talk about a breakout receiver. Khalil Pimpleton had 4 catches on 5 targets for 153 yards, including a 70-yarder in there. Clock management killed the Elks in this one. This is their 4th straight game of losing by a field goal. The 3rd straight time it was a walk-off field goal with zeros on the clock. They didn't manage the clock well, as you had mentioned. They were in a 1st and goal situation. It took them 3 tries to get in, but Dakota Prukop could have let that clock run down to 1 or 2 seconds before taking the final snap. After a kickoff out of bounds, they needed 1 completion to get into field goal range. Lewis Ward came on, didn't miss, and a walk-off win for the Red Blacks.
Great catch by Geno Lewis to set that all up. One-hander against 2 defenders, unbelievable. Boris Bede, with instructions to dribble the kickoff, kicks it out of bounds. Because the kickoff happens from the 30-yard line, the penalty is applied 30 yards up the field. That means Ottawa is set up at their 50 with 8 seconds to go. No time has run off the clock. And again, Khalil Pimpleton does it. And the pass that he catches inside of 3 defenders with a 4th one trying to swing at the football. What a throw by Drew Brown to set up the game-winning field goal.
This game shows that Drew Brown has what it takes to be a starting quarterback in this league. And we're not just talking about the 480 yards. He played a very smart game and a gutsy game. That was not an easy pass to throw or to catch. They did what they needed to do to get into field goal range. And if we want to go back to Boris Bede's kickoff here a little bit, Bede has, I would estimate, the strongest leg in the league as far as a kicker goes. He could have given that thing everything he had and potentially got a rouge that would have put them up by a point as well. And the shorter kick, poor call and a poor execution in my mind.
He had done it prior in the game. He had kicked the football into the end zone and Ottawa had conceded the point. You're right. He could have kicked it to the goal line and at least given the option if you get down there and make a spectacular play, you may win the game right then and there. He was told not to. He would dribble the ball. It went and scored it. And let's give some credit to these Ottawa returners who knew enough not to touch that football. Because if they'd have picked it up, that would have been it, and they would have been going to overtime. For Ottawa, that puts them over 500 at 3-2. This is the latest they've been above 500 in a long time.
It was great to see Bob Dice's reaction as well when Lewis Ward kicked that walk-off field goal. To see a head coach that passionate about a win, you realize how important it is to these guys. And for Ottawa to be at 3-2 at this point in the season, it looks like they are more competitive this year than they have been in the last couple. So great to see all around for the Red Blacks.
And a final note on this, Khalil Pimpleton, that little dump pass that he took across the middle, and then he outlegged 3 defenders to get to the end zone. Where did those jets come from? You can't teach speed, and he has it in spades.
Third down.
Once again, it's 4 games in the Canadian Football League, and for the first time this year, we're not playing on a Thursday night. It's a doubleheader Friday, with the Edmonton Elks going to Ottawa, to the Ottawa Redblacks. The Redblacks 1.5-point favorites at home.
Given what we saw from Ottawa last week, I like them at home this week. Looks like Edmonton is going to be in some turmoil with the coaching change. That can go 2 ways. You can get a bit of a bump from the coaching change, or it can be complete disarray. I think it's going to be a little bit more confusion, so I like the Red Blacks at home to win and to cover this one.
Ottawa is undefeated at home this year. the bump that they got from defeating Edmonton in Edmonton on such an emotional game. There's no way they're going to take the Elks lightly. But if they've got the weapons now that they want to attack the Elks, it's going to be tough. And traditionally, in-season changes at head coach, opening night doesn't go well. They typically, more often than not, will lose. And that's pretty much an axiom in any league that you go to. That's the question now for Jarious Jackson. He's got the dual role. He's got offensive coordinator and head coach. He's worked with G. Roy Simon before. The two know each other from BC. That kind of collegiality will help them in the long run. The question being raised by so many people is, how invested are the players right now? Are they looking to turn this around? Or are they so dismayed over what's happening that they may have started to check out?
Are you under the same impression I am then, that this is Ottawa's at home and by more than 1.5?
Oh, yeah, I haven't said anything. I'm going to put money on Ottawa to cover the 1.5. Later that night, you and I are going to be in Regina to watch the Winnipeg Blue Bombers play the first of 3 with the Saskatchewan Roughriders, 2 of them being in Regina. The Roughriders, they open as 1.5 favorites. This is basically a pick'em. Bombers are on a 2-game win streak. Roughriders lose their first. Where do you go with this?
Hot off of a 2-game win streak, and now the Bombers are underdogs for the first time this season. Who can figure that all out? I do like the Roughriders at home in this one. Winnipeg beat Ottawa on the heels of their defense. They beat Calgary on the heels of their offense. I think the consistency that we've seen from the Roughriders this year will allow them to pull it off. So I'm taking the Riders at home and to cover the 1.5.
Blue Bombers haven't seen a rush defense like the Roughriders have provided this year. Huge focal point for how this game goes. If Brady Oliveira goes off, then the Roughriders are in big trouble. But if the Roughriders defense stands up the way they have been and keeps them in check, that means that Zach Collaros is going to do a lot of work slinging the football. Will Ontario Wilson have a night like he had before? Expect some double coverage to change all of that. I like the Roughriders at home and the cover. It's a tough one to call because Winnipeg has played very well in Regina the last few years. The only loss was Labor Day last year, and that was in overtime.
It's going to be a fun one. I don't know. Yes, the spread's 1.5. I don't know if it goes much beyond that. But again, when these two teams play, it can be a very close game or it can be a blowout one way or the other.
Move to Saturday night, and the Toronto Argonauts take their road show. This is the 3rd in a row for them, to Hamilton to take on the Tiger Cats. The Argonauts are 4.5-point favorites on the road in Hamilton. Ticats coming off a bye. Unlike Edmonton, the Ticats win coming off a bye. The Elks have really struggled. Well, did really struggle with Chris Jones.
Again, this is a tough one. Hamilton has been competitive in some games, not in some games. The Argos had an emotional and big upset win against Montreal last week. I'm going to favor the Argonauts to win, but I think Hamilton keeps it close. So Hamilton beats the 4.5 in this one, but I think just the consistency of what we've seen from the Argonauts so far this season pulls them through.
Question mark for me is the Hamilton defense. They got torched by the BC Lions and torched badly. How do they respond? Is Mark Washington now looking over his shoulder because Chris Jones is available? And Chris Jones, first and foremost, was a defensive coordinator. He does have a relationship with Scott Milanovich, that from their days in Toronto. How does that play into all of this? He's looking for work. Mark Washington wants to keep his job. This is a huge test for that Hamilton defense. If they do not step up and do something different and make themselves a factor in this game, Toronto is going to cover and win on the road. We finish with the hottest team in football, the British Columbia Lions, who, despite losing on opening night in Toronto, have not lost since, and their road show goes to Calgary to take on the Stampeders. A couple of weeks ago, I would have said BC blowout, but the Stampeders are really starting to turn their season into something. I like what I see, and what we saw against Winnipeg was Calgary challenged them deep. That is huge because now everything's on the table when it comes to Jake Mayer and what he can do.
That combined with the running game that the Stampeders showed as well, that offense has certainly come alive. I'm still leaning towards BC. I mean, I know I, amongst many, thought Montreal was going to handle Toronto pretty easily last week as well. And unfortunately, we saw Cody Fajardo go down. Things got away from the Alouettes in that one. What we've seen from Vernon Adams in this BC offense so far has me thinking, keep picking them until somebody proves me wrong. I like what the Lions have done so far. And we saw Calgary give up 41 points to Winnipeg last week. This BC Lions offense is every bit as potent as the Winnipeg Blue Bombers. So I'm taking BC to win and to win big.
Vernon Adams Jr. was sacked a couple times by the Rough Riders last week. I'm sure that's going to be a focus for the Lions. Keep him clean. The whole season rides on whether or not Vernon Adams can play all 18 and play it healthily. This is going to be a huge test for the Calgary Stampeders. If they really want to show that they are a mark that you have to be aware of on this schedule, then you have to put up against the BC Lions. After what the Lions did to the Rough Riders, after what the Lions did to the Tiger Cats, it's hard, like you say, to bet against them. Nothing in my mind tells me anything that the BC Lions aren't going to win and win big in this football game. Big being 10 points, not 30.
Third Down Gamble uses the expert resources of the Canadian Football League and 3 Down Nation. For up-to-date, insightful statistics and analysis, please visit cfl.ca and 3downnation.com. The CFL on CBC theme music is used with written permission from the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation.
Thank you for listening to our show. Third Down Gamble is hosted on Podbean. Follow us on Twitter, where our handle is @ThirdDownGamble. Join us again next time. The Third Down Gamble Podcast. Audio worth watching.